Welcome everybody to another edition of Coffee and Open Source, a place to meet some new friends, have some great conversations, and maybe learn something down the way. I'm your host, Isaac Levin. If you're enjoying the conversations here, be sure to like, subscribe, follow wherever you're watching or listening. Also, if you or somebody you know would like to come on and have a chat with me, be sure to reach out to me on all the social media platforms. You can find them if you go to isaacl.dev. All right, so I'm looking forward to this. I was talking to him before we got started about how we've been in a lot of places at the same time. We've never actually sat down for a proper longer chat. So this is what this is going to be. So let's just get right into it. So my guest today is David Whitney. David, do you want to say hello and introduce yourself?
Hey everybody. My name's David. I'm based out of London in the UK, and I am the director of software architecture for a company called NewDay. You probably never heard of us. Don't worry about that. We do fintech stuff. Super exciting though. So if any of my bosses ever ended up watching, that's why. So welcome. Great to be here.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it. And one, because I find, we were talking about this before we got started, I find you as just a genuinely, you have a unique voice, and you say things that you would without having to worry about, saying the wrong thing, because you usually say the right thing. And one of the things I love to get started with is kind of how it got started for you. So when did you realize that technology was the thing that you wanted to be a part of?
To do forever. That's the scary thing, isn't it? How did you know this one you want to spend your entire life doing?
Sure, yeah.
I kind of have two things that stuck in my head. So when I was very, very little, I grew up in Hong Kong. And I remember going to the night markets in the late 80s when the Game Boy had just come out. And I remember walking, I must have been 5 or 6 years old, walking down these streets and looking at the video game cartridge boxes, super colorful stores down the market. And my mother at the time buying me a Game Boy. And I was a very excitable, attention requiring young man. We'll go with that. And the fact that there was this little box that was absolutely magic, that would do whatever I wanted forever. And I remember right then it feeling like there was some kind of magic trick. So that's kind of the first and sillier answer.
Sure.
I think when I really knew this was for me was probably when I was about 11 years old and I went to high school. And during my first year, my first month there, some kid sold me a floppy disk with a copy of Prince of Persia and three programs that he had written, a rubbish little calculator program. I'm not sure I've ever told this story in such detail. A little calculator program and some other thing that he'd written in QBasic. And and there's just that one moment that seems really formidably exciting. The idea that this kid who was my age had made the thing that he sold me for £1. And I was mind blown by the fact that he'd made the thing that I could put in the computer that my mother had at home to do overtime for her secretarial job at work at the time. And the idea that there was another world entirely that I had no access to was the most exciting, weird thing that fired off all of those kind of creative bits in the back of my brain. And I think I've spent my entire life trying to get that feeling back.
Yeah.
Basically.
Yeah. No, that's a great story. I've always, I don't know if they do this when you were growing up or where you live, but so there's this thing where it's you're supposed to take a test of if you could do anything in the world, what would you do? And it's supposed to kind of figure out what your passions are. And I was always a very curious person. So I was taking stuff apart, putting it back together. But I grew up, my introduction to computers was Web 2.0. And building a website for the first time. I had a class in high school, and it's literally you put stuff into Notepad, you hit save, and then the browser refreshed with the info, right? And
you get that feedback.
Yeah, right. And after that, to your point, I've been chasing this feeling of that, there's limitless opportunity. I've been chasing that for a long time too.
I think I was just really lucky that the time, and I have all these weird formative stories that kind of coalesced into the same place. I had a Commodore 64 growing up, and I remember typing programs out from the book, but I didn't know I was programming. I didn't realize it was a thing.
Sure.
Because I was too young. I was very, very little. And I think that there was just that kind of moment that, like, for people that got into technology in the early to mid 90s, very specifically, we were kind of growing at the same age as all the technology, so you could know everything.
Hmm.
And especially when you're a kid, when, like, frankly, you don't know shit, right? You don't even know what
Yeah.
you don't
Yeah.
know when you're a kid. It just always felt like there was this mass of unknown. It seems trite to say it was like adventure, but it felt like
Sure. No, no.
I was having an adventure. And I remember, all these other little stories. Like, I used to go and sit in my mum's office when she was working on my way home from school, and I would read the antivirus definitions on her Windows 3.1 computer, because
Interesting.
it seemed like this
Yeah.
weird,
Yeah. Yeah.
bizarre, magic thing that I couldn't grasp. So I think I kind of knew then. I kind
Yeah.
of knew then that there was this thing that I just wanted to keep on pulling the thread on, until it did what I wanted it to do. And I learned web programming as the browser was being invented,
Yeah.
and I learned JavaScript as JavaScript was invented, and I learned C to write Perl scripts, or
Hmm.
indeed the stuff that ran on the servers underneath the Perl scripts. And there was just kind of this accumulation of knowledge, and it gets under your skin.
Yeah.
I think you know what? There's always this thing, like, if I was born 200 years earlier, what would I do? Well, I'd probably die as a low rent court jester, or a
Sure.
common farmer
Yeah.
somewhere, right? Like,
Yeah.
be good at nothing else.
Yeah, no, I was asked this question when I think I was a senior in high school, like, because I was at that point I decided, like, computers. I don't know what it is yet. I don't know what my job's gonna be, but it has to be with computers. And somebody asked me, is like, well, what if the computer thing doesn't work out? I said, that's not an option. Like you said, like, I'm probably going to be working at fast food or working a retail job, because I don't have any other interests that make me as excited about is typing stuff into a file and then saving it and then seeing what it does. Like, I like that level of whatever it tickles in my brain, like the creativity, the problem solving, whatever it is. I haven't I've tried lots of different silly hobbies, and I've never been able to keep a hobby as much as just writing code. Like,
I think there's a really it's interesting that you put it that way, because the way that I have always perceived myself, and I almost, at one point, I went to a very traditional high school,
sure.
and they didn't do computing. There wasn't computer science. There wasn't programming. Again, it was the mid to late 90s, but it was very, very trad. And I almost went to art school.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
almost I wanted to do fine art and history of
Sure.
art originally. Ironically, I think I wanted to be an architect.
Mm.
Um,
Yeah, no, there's some similarities there, and I always, like, we talked about this on the show 1,000 times, but there is a Venn diagram of people that are artistic and like fine art and
Verge.
proper art, and people that like computer science. Like, I know that you love music. You, like you said, you like art. Obviously, I play instruments, and there's so many people out there that they sculpt or they draw, and it's just like, oh, I also do this computer thing too. And, like, there used to
Yeah.
be this stigma that, like, computer scientists are people, like, just nerd, like, left side of the brain oriented, like, not creative at all. But it's like, no, there's tons of creativity, especially, like, if you look at, like, some code that was written that actually does a good job, and it's not hard to explain, it's not hard to read, it's like, it makes you feel really good. If I don't want to compare it to, like, being able to see, like, a piece of art on the wall. Like, it's not like going to the art museum and looking at code, but it's a similar feeling that I get, right?
I, I don't know. I think it is. And it's really interesting that we talk about this, because one of the things I've been coming to as I get older
Yeah.
is realizing that that's exactly the aesthetic perspective I take on the work. Like, if I'd have gone and been a painter, I would have a body of work that was paintings.
Sure.
Actually, I think the software I write occupies the same place in my brain for me. Now, it doesn't mean that everybody has to see it that way, right? Not all pictures are art, right?
Yeah.
Like it's fine.
Sure.
Like, the medium is not the message, but I think once you really, like, you hook yourself to that line of really, like, giving a shit about the thing that you're doing, to the extent you almost become obsessed about it. Um, okay, so I often ask this question of people, but I think it's kind of funny. What do you think the meaning of art? What is art? How would you define art in a soundbite?
I think art is how people relay the feeling they have onto something or to something.
Got it.
Right?
Got it in one, right?
Yeah. Like
art is the way that people in the artists, it's the work that artists leave behind to deal with the human condition.
Yeah, and it's all subjective, right? Like I've said this 1,000 times, and like I have friends that look at me like I'm just a heathen because I don't appreciate modern art very much. Like I'll go to a modern art museum and I'll look at it and I'll understand why it's valuable to that artist and it's valuable to the people that are looking at that particular piece or whatever.
You don't love it.
I'll just say like it's not for me. But then I'll go and I'll see like, you know, I'm a huge fan of like Renaissance era art. So like, you know, like, I think a lot of people fall into that category, right? But I'll see like, you know, my favorite painting ever is La Grande Jatte, right? Like the famous pointillism piece where it's just people sitting on the side of the riverbank. And, you know, I used to live in Chicago and I used to go to that museum a lot because for whatever reason, whenever I would sit there, I would just like basically just, I don't know if it's, my body would like teleport into it and I would have like this feeling of like being a part of the art. And I've never felt that with any other piece. And I don't know what it is. And I like Monet and I like Van Gogh and I like all of the traditional artists of our time, the classics, right? But I've just never really resonated with modern art. And I'll talk to a friend who is very much like big into modern art and they just look at me just like I'm just uncultured piece of shit, right? Which is just so funny. Because, you know, you can have the same conversation about music, right? Some people are like, oh, like the Beatles. It's like, and then there's other people that are like, oh, the Beatles aren't really that good. And like, you know, it's one of those things where we have to be okay with the art not resonating with you because it resonates for others, or even if it was just for the artist itself.
And I think that's the thing. Like computer software for me is the way that I can change the world and rationalize the world that I interact with. It's the thing I have, and I think that's what makes it art for me.
Yeah. Here's a silly question. Do you think there's an opportunity for there to like, and I don't want to say like GitHub is this, but like, you know, we've also seen code that you look at it and you're like, oh yeah, and then you look at some code and you're like, oh no. Do you think that there is a place for, you know, whether it's a gallery, that's a terrible way to phrase it, but it's like you look at some really good algorithm, like coding algorithms. Do you think that there's a place for that?
So, you know what, I've had this this idea in the back of my brain for 10 years now. It's never come to fruition, and maybe one day I'll manage to do it. What I would really, really love would be to collect a gallery, a traditional gallery, because one of the things that I think plagues the world very, very often is that normal people that don't interact with software don't know what code is. They can't conceive of it. They can't actualize it. They can't think about it. I would love to make an exhibition of some of the most beautiful code in the world that shows the people who wrote the software.
Oh yeah.
The software itself. So for instance, I always had this one example. The I forget which of the American rockets it was, but I know they open source a lot of the original software. And I wish this anecdote was better where I had precise details, but I know one of the launch routines were published, and there's a joke in the launch routine. The function name is called Burn Baby because Disco Inferno was written when they were writing this program, and I just love the fact that you can see the people through the work, while simultaneously the work produced something of great value. And I would just love to put an exhibition together and partner with a bunch of artists who could visually represent the impact of different pieces of beautiful software that showed the humanity from inside of them. In the thing, I think it'd be so cool. You know, maybe when in another 10 years or in another 5 years, maybe someone will hear this and send me an email and say, let's do it.
I'll fund it. Yeah.
Let's do it.
For what it's worth, that's Apollo 11. So like the rocket that put people on the moon for the first time. Like I don't remember what it was. It was like Burn Baby Burn was like the co-routine or something like that, which is hilarious to think about it. Just absolutely hilarious. Like 1968, 1969. Yeah.
The brilliant thing about that though is I think the that software is always better when we remember that it's for people.
Yeah.
And that is like a thread through all of software, through open source software. It's a thread through like user experience design. Every time you forget that there's actually people that are interacting with these systems, you build the prison that
Yeah.
we live in, right? Rather than building software that does good for people.
Yeah, it reminds me, it's not the exact same, but it's kind of similar. So where I live in Seattle, there's the Museum of Pop Culture. It used to be called the Jimi Hendrix Museum. Like
I have been.
you've
It's
been,
beautiful.
yeah, right. So it's a well-known museum, and they have a lot of really cool musical artifacts, and they have like pop culture stuff. Like they have like Luke's hand from Empire Strikes Back, which is pretty cool. But they have an exhibition there about with indie game development. So you can go into this room and you can play all of these different independently made games and learn something about the creators of the game and all that sort of stuff. And it's challenging for me, one, because it makes me one, my kids will never leave that room. My kids will go in there and they'll play like for 3 hours straight because there's all these really cool games. But two, like it's really hard for me because I just see like these are people that are putting their kind of their life into it. And sometimes people appreciate it and sometimes people don't. And then I get into my own head about like, oh, I'm just writing like crappy code for some crappy company, right? I'm not making a game that's in a museum, right? And I immediately start to get like imposter syndrome, right? Which is kind of funny.
But you know what? It's the XKCD comic that everyone loves, right? It's the one guy in Minnesota maintaining the 20-line open source library that makes the world work.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Right? And I think there's obvious parallels there, and like I think it's very, very difficult for programmers to feel seen through the work because we're invisible if it goes wrong.
Yeah.
Yeah. Definition.
I was trying to I by no means know how Netflix works or Amazon works or Google search works, but I was trying to relate this to a friend years ago. Because they were talking about like how Netflix wasn't like recommending like shows they liked. And I was like, you have to understand like the Netflix recommendation algorithm, like it's built on top of this and this and this. And they're looking at me like I'm speaking Dutch, right? Or whatever. And then I equated to like, it's not just what you like. It's what you like added to with like the things that you and other people like. And then with those people like, so it's this entire graph of people. And that's how it builds like weights to basically show you shows. And this person was like, I would rather just not have it because I don't want to see all these shows that I have no interest in watching. And I'm like, well, okay, well, I can't help you. Like, if you don't want to like, and it's just interesting because everybody's so dependent on technology, but nobody knows how any of it works. Even the people that are experts in technology don't know how 99% of the tech in the world works, right? Like, it's pretty fascinating that we have this huge dependency on all of this stuff that we're just blind to and we just take for granted and we just assume that it's going to give us what we want. Like my kid freaks out about like the internet not working and I don't know anything about Wi-Fi. Like I don't know how it works, but like we're so dependent on it and if it was to go wrong, I'm like, okay, well, I'll just reset the router and maybe it'll just work. But I don't know.
I think there's a mixture of like the magic trick, and it's funny to think about trying to be an idiot again, like I was when I was a child. And like I think the older I get and the longer I spend in technology, the more I could give you a good educated guess about how most things work.
Sure.
And actually you lose a little bit of the wonder when you understand the foundational pillars of computing, right? Like the wonder goes away because you see through it.
Yeah.
But I think maybe there's a generational shift happening here as well, where for people roughly my age, you were kind of always exposed to the nuts and bolts of technology. Like everything was simple enough that you could comprehend it and complicated enough that it still did something useful. It was like that cusp, that transitionary period. And I do wonder sometimes if we're now in an era where everything has been productized to such an extreme degree that the fact that you are using hundreds of computers a day is invisible to most people. And that's maybe it's sad, maybe it's progress. I can't really tell.
Well, that was something that I wanted to bring up. It's like, because we live in this world now where there's hyper specialization in tech, right? Like you talk to people that, are your age or even people that are a little bit older than you, and they talk about like what tech was, and they talk about like how the tech community was and like the foundings of open source, how that was. You talk to people now and like somebody can be like a React front end developer. That's all. That's all they know. Yeah.
So fascinating, because I think this is like, and we were joking about living in the dystopia, and before we came on the show, I think we're in this weird inflection point where technology in the last 10 years has grown so rapidly. And it's funny, like, I always look at this through this weird lens of like JavaScript frameworks.
Sure.
And people often ask me like, oh, what's going to replace React? I'm like, well, probably nothing, probably React. Or some riff on it.
The next version of React.
Like, oh, but we've changed before. Remember, we used Angular. I'm like, yeah. And before that, we, maybe we were using Backbone or Knockout. And I sat there, have to explain to them, there's like 10, 20, 100 times more people doing the job at every hump, right? There's orders of magnitude more people doing these things. So to shift an entire community is like 10, 20, 30, 100 times more complicated. Mm-hmm. And I think the same thing kind of dovetailed neatly into the way that tech and skills worked, right? Because as our industry grew rapidly, corporations needed bodies, right? They needed more meat for the grinder, essentially. We have more websites than we could possibly build. So for a corporation, specialization is really great, because it allows you to control worker wages and keep people well defined and keep people in boxes and write nice career paths. So specialization, it's not really specialization, of course, it's narrow focus. Kind of gives you nice replaceable units of people. At the exact same time, the tech industry needed so many more people to get into it that we started really enfranchising alternate routes into the industry.
Yes.
Because there's like these three eras here as well, right? There's like the hacker do anything community of like the 70s and 80s when the industry was really forming. There's kind of the traditional computer science route that like was really a 1990s thing mostly. And then the pipe didn't have enough people in it. So we're like, okay, well, let's open this up. And, we saw the flourishing of boot camps and Code Academy and the Learn to Code things, and kind of this slightly toxic positivity that the only valid thing to do was to learn technology, right?
Sure. Yeah.
Fuck those liberal arts students, go and learn to code, do a real job.
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
And it never sat right with me, the sentiment of it. And now there's loads of great people that come through that path that I love dearly. I've worked with them, I've hired them on my team. So this isn't like a no boot camps thing. But then you look at how these two things coalesce, right? So you've got an industry that just wants more people in narrow roles, and you've got people that realize that the fastest route to making good money is to specialize. So they basically self-select. And they've never seen a generalist in their lives because they've come through this narrow pipe into a narrow job. And I think at this point, we're in our like first generation of technical leaders who think that generalists don't exist because they've never seen one, because their entire journey through their own engineering career was that of a narrowly focused specialist. And like, to me, that's kind of, it's wild, because I grew up as a generalist. I learned everything. That everything is bigger now. There's more of everything. It's a harder job than just accumulating knowledge piece by piece. But I think we've got, I think we've got to this weird place where specialization is really great advice early career, because you get your senior title and you get your pay bumps and everything is good. But actually, specialization is the death of a life in technology. Because at some point, the thing that you bet on, the thing that you have loved, is going to die, or it will mutate into something else. And if you do not understand that is kind of the shape of an industry you're interacting with, you're going to be hurt the first time it happens. And you see it a lot.
Yeah, I'll push back a little bit, because there are definitely, like, I was thinking about this the other day about, like, when I first got started, I was working in an insurance company, and like the insurance company was run on like, had a whole bunch of COBOL, right? And I was thinking about the other day about how, like, if you didn't retire, like, you could still make a ton of money in COBOL. And I remember,
don't ruin my future plan. I'm gonna train up on COBOL and go.
Yeah, very good, very good. But I remember, because my first day, I met another person who started a very similar time frame, and I got hired as like a .NET developer. We're going to be building like web forms and WCF and stuff like that, right? And I was talking to this guy. I'm like, oh, so what are you working on? He's like, oh, like, I'm kind of maintaining some of our COBOL programs, and I'm doing things. And in my head, I was like, oh, that sounds awful, because like, here he is. He's coming out of college. He probably learned Java in college or whatever.
Why would you want to learn COBOL?
And
Right?
his first job was COBOL. And now I was thinking the other day, I was like, man, if that guy stuck with COBOL, he's probably making like $300,000 a year. Like, because as everybody in tech knows, like all the folks that wrote COBOL are either retired or dead. So,
You know, COBOL.net existed for a time.
yes, yeah, no,
Cross-compile COBOL to the
yeah,
CLR.
yeah. I remember I worked with a guy who I don't remember what the technology was called, so I'm not even going to try. But he was like one of 4 people on the planet who still like knew all the stuff. And like he was an older guy, he was super sharp, he was super nice. And I remember like the CIO of my company came to, like, they were doing like a tour of like all of the offices, and he came and he, you know, the guy was doing the speech, and he looked over and he said, Lee? And he learned that same technology when he was getting started, and like looked up to this guy when he was getting started. And now he's like the CIO of a huge insurance company. And he literally had like a, you know, it's like when you meet your hero for the first time, right? And it was just a very, I didn't appreciate it at the time, but now I think about it all the time. Like, man, that must have been absolutely wild to like, you know, because there's some dedication in that, right? Because this guy decided to stay in this particular tech area his entire career, became an expert in it, to the effect that like, if somebody recognized his face, they would be very excited to see him, which is very interesting.
Yeah, technology simultaneously can be a big and a small world.
Yeah,
I think is the truth. But yeah, I think the truth is, if you can obviously specialize, and I think there's a truth that any significantly successful piece of technology is basically evergreen.
sure.
Right? It might not be what the exciting new work is in, but you will be employable.
Oh yeah.
Despite maybe what the AI people repeatedly try and claim. But
Yeah, well, I want to talk about that later on, because I definitely think that there's something to say, especially as we transition into like the open source conversation, is like when, and this is kind of a rough, a sharp turn, so I apologize. Like when did you realize that there was this thing called open source and people were posting their code online? Like, because you talk to people that come from the generation where it's like, you know, you got code magazines in the mail, or you got code discs in the mail, or whatever, right? That was kind of open source. Like, obviously not to the scale of what it is now, but it kind of is, right? People were sharing their code. I don't know what licensing was like back then or whatever, but like, you know, when did you realize that there was this whole community of people that were just like writing their stuff maybe for themselves, and they're sharing it because they thought maybe other people might like it too?
yeah, I think by the time it hit me was probably about 97 or 98.
Okay.
So I used to hang out on Usenet,
Yeah.
and I used to hang out in programming groups on Usenet. And I remember hearing about alternate operating systems at the time, right? And you know, I was never big into the early days of Linux. Like I tried it out a few times, but I remember weirdly, I remember using, there was an operating system called BIOS that existed for a time, which was, I believe, originally an operating system that was competing with NextStep to be the next macOS back in the late 90s when Apple were down on their luck, and they were publishing versions of their operating system on cover mount CDs. There's a famous, I don't know if it ever made it to the States, a famous magazine in the UK called Computer Shopper. And it basically is a catalog. It's just a catalog of resale listings, but they often had cover mounted CDs. And through kind of some of the stuff that was on the front of their early talk of Linux, like reading things like websites like the Register in the mid to late 90s, I came kind of aware that first that Linux was a thing. And you know, bear in mind, in the late 90s, I'll have been 15,
Sure.
16 years old. But I was part of these communities where we were sharing software anyway, and we weren't really thinking about licenses but it's funny because clearly at the same time the Free Software Foundation and some of the more foundational works of open source was happening in American universities. You know, it did stuff going on labs and the original kind of Linux distributions, and all of that stuff was happening. I think in the UK we felt a little bit far away from it because we had this like alternate timeline of hobbyist computer programming in the microcomputing era. So we had like a different lineage that started to come together in the late 90s and early 2000s here. So I think, for me, the first time I started explicitly putting out software that I perceived to be open source was probably some rubbishy PHP CMSs that have been
Sure.
forgotten to time in about 1999, 2000s.
For
That
what
kind of
it's
year.
for what it's worth, like the backbone of the internet is like rubbish PHP stuff.
It's a bunch of rubbish PHP scripts glued together, right?
So yeah. So I mean, I love this conversation because one, as somebody who came into tech, I'm I was born in '86, so like a lot of the stuff that I get to talk with people that have been doing it a bit longer, it's very fascinating because, it's kind of like, and I don't want to had this sound offensive. It's like, when cavemen like first created fire, or like, or when somebody like, took some beans from a tree and mashed it together and they found out it was chocolate. Right. Like some of these like discoveries that people have. And I just like, I have envy of like being in that era when you realize here's a side tangent. Like, so your favorite thing that you've ever eaten in your entire life, like, do you remember the first time you had that first bite of like the most, like the best thing you've ever eaten?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
I think so.
And I'll add it. Also, I'll add to the next, I'll add this as it relates to tech. When you think about the first program that you wrote, if you remember what the first program you wrote is, like, do you immediately go back to that time and you feel like that really warm, drippy nostalgia? Or do you just like, oh, it's just some bunk thing that I built and whatever?
I have so much nostalgia for the 90s internet. Like,
sure.
So much nostalgia. But I think when I think about, and I'm a digital hoarder, so I've still got some of these things lying around. I remember being hopelessly lost, but having a good time.
Yeah.
That's the feeling that kind of sticks with me. It's like that feeling of pure wonder. And I remember learning HTML and not realizing it was programming.
Yeah.
I remember, and I'm sure there's jokes in there that other people can make. They're not real. I remember writing my first non-trivial program, which definitely will age me. I wrote a text editor.
Sure.
And the special thing about the text editor was there were two text editing windows, and I built in an FTP client to maintain a website. And that was the height of, and I wrote that in C, I will call it C++. I copy and pasted samples and copy typed from books to get something that worked. And I remember having like my first 1,000 users of this weird text editor, because it was kind of the era where people would really just download anything you stuck on the internet and then try it out and tell you if they liked it or not. And I remember thinking that I finally kind of understood something. And the truth, I think, is this. I reckon every programmer probably sucks for the first 10 years of their career.
I mean, some of us will suck forever. Some of us will suck forever. Sorry, David, you're one of the 1%. Like you.
But I think the first 10 years is the hard bit, right? Is the hard 10 years. And I think if you get through that first 10 years of feeling like you suck, you feel like you suck a little bit less. And I was just lucky that happened to me when I was a teenager.
Yeah, I think the way I phrase it is that like we're okay. We have more pain tolerance. So like I use the anecdote all the time. It's like, oh, people talk to me. It's like, oh, like how do you get into tech? I want to get into tech. What do I do? What sort of classes should I take? What, do I go get Udemy or Pluralsight or whatever? I'm like, and I just say the first thing you have to do is you have to recognize that like there's pain in this. And I don't mean that in like a negative way, like because
bounce off the wall.
Yeah, because I'll tell you this, and I've told this story 1,000 times. I actually had the last time on my show, I had like the person the story's about, which is, so if anybody watched that previous episode, but basically, like the dopamine hit when things work is worth days of pain. Absolute days of pain. We've all been there where we're building something and like it's just not working. Like you get a bug, you fix that bug, it shows up another bug. I don't know, something is like 5 pixels to the left when it shouldn't be or whatever, right? And you're blaming the browser because it's always the browser. But then when it works, it's like, I mean, I equate it to like a joke. I said this to my wife one time, and she looked at me like I was insane. I'm like, it's like seeing your kid, or it's like, you kiss the girl, or you kiss the guy, or like whatever, right? Like you get like that feeling of just like washing over you, and like that powers you for like 10, 15 more days of pain. And when I tell people this, they give me this look like, why would you do that? And I'm like, because it feels so good when it works.
Yeah, why do athletes run? I don't know why athletes run. I don't run. Sounds horrible to me.
I run. I still don't know why I run.
I'm sure they would, but I'm sure like an Olympic athlete would tell you a similar story.
Yeah. Or,
and they would see it differently, but it's the same fundamental human experience.
Yeah. Or like even like running is a bit, in my opinion, like running. There's a better analogy. Like if you're a professional rugby player, you're running all the time and you're getting smashed into constantly. So you're in a state of pain at all times. Why would you do that? Because it feels good to score a goal or whatever, right? Yeah. And I'm going to take another hard turn. When did you realize that there's good money in tech?
I think I was just lucky. I remember telling, it's ridiculous. I remember going to university. I come from a pretty poor background.
Sure.
And I was very lucky to go to university is kind of how I felt about it. I remember being quite anti-establishment and telling my mother that as long as I made enough money to open a cafe with some friends and pay the bills, then I would be happy. And I am so bougie. I live a very, very comfortable life now, and I can't imagine. Ironically, I do kind of run some bars with some friends, but I can never imagine that being enough for me.
Sure.
I think the money and tech has always been a very, very complicated thing, right? Because when you get into something because you love it, the idea that the work becomes a job is something probably born of necessity. Like I never got up in the morning wanting to add value to $1 billion company.
Yeah,
that wasn't what got me up in the
no,
morning.
you didn't write that. You didn't write that as you're like, what do you want to be?
Exactly.
What do you want to be when you're an adult? I want to build forms. Right? I want to build forms over data for $1 billion company.
Yeah, exactly that. But I think I realized that a couple of things I think happened for me. Like I was still am very into video games. I remember I was playing early World of Warcraft, and I was quite into World of Warcraft. And I was putting all this effort in. I was driving home from my second tech job to do this kind of work, to plan raids. I remember quitting and just thinking, man, if I just put all that work into my actual job, actually I get the same kind of feedback from it, and I'll be a lot better off. And I just channeled all that energy. Like it was like on a dime like that. I changed my mind. And I was always really into it. And I've been doing it since I was a kid, but like taking that extracurricular energy, which is kind of, the weaponized passion that companies will take from you now, really. But I just decided that like if I was ever going to be making things, I'd make them for me.
Yeah.
And I thought that was really important. I think for me it was set against this culture of 90s computing that I came from. It was all about making things.
Yeah.
And you move to London and you need to pay London bills.
Sure.
So you got to make money somewhere. Is the truth?
Yeah. No, I mean, I grew up in a not great. My background's not that great. Like I grew up on welfare and food stamps and that. And my goal in life was always to like was making money. And then I remember my first job, and I was like, the amount of money that I was making was more than like my parents would make in multiple years. Right.
Yeah.
And now I look back and I'm like, how did I live on that amount of money? Right. And I get like I feel kind of gross. Like,
I think money it's very difficult though, isn't it?
Yeah.
Like I've often, and I was probably protected from the worst of, I don't know whether I'd describe it as poverty. I had a very odd upbringing, which was very up and down, but we didn't have a lot. My mother managed to protect me from the fact we didn't have a lot until she was doing better. So I'm forever thankful for having a very stoic and impressive parent. And I think, you never forget kind of the poverty trauma of being poor, and the fear that comes with, right? The fear of, I remember moving out from home, and every time I got a letter in the post, I was afraid to open it in case it was a bill.
Yeah.
And I think that there was something about, a career in tech that protects you from that.
Hmm.
But I wish I could tell you that that was the plan all along, or that
Sure.
it was
Sure.
a thing that I chose to defend me from this horrible thing. And I think, what it has done, though, I think working in technology has shaped my perspective, the way that people interact with money, actually. And I
Yeah.
think,
Yeah.
you meet a lot of
Sorry,
people
finish
are
it. Yeah.
overly driven by it.
Yeah. No.
I guess I suppose the thought is nothing but this. I think we're very, very fortunate to work in technology, and I think it's worthwhile for people to remember that fortune sometimes is
Yeah.
part effort and work and opportunity, right?
Yeah. No, for sure. And I agree with that. And I don't by any means say that I'm like, you know, jaded to the fact that like I'm in tech and I'm able to provide for my family and all of that, right? But it's interesting because like there have been opportunities in my life where I could take more money or I could take less money, and it's always very challenging because in my brain I have like this same thing where it's like, okay, well it's one mistake and like I'm going to the we're
You're back in the bank,
right,
right?
exactly, and I tell people this like I don't monetize this show. I don't take sponsors. I don't put ads up. I don't do any of that because the second that money touches it, I'm going to not enjoy doing it anymore. I do this very much like this is a selfish endeavor for Isaac. I get to talk with
Yeah,
really cool people for an hour about what they find interesting. And if I was to soil that with money, I wouldn't enjoy it as much. And like that's how I'm able to cope. And I think when I think about open source, and this is kind of what I want to talk with open source with you about, is like, the idea of like, passing, whether it's passing the ladder down or providing something that somebody would have to do themselves or engaging with people that share interests in this space. Like, what do you think open source like really means to you? Is it the community piece of
yeah.
it? Is it the ability to provide value for other people? Like, what exactly is it about open source that resonates so much for you?
I think there's a very, very complicated answer here,
Sure,
especially
sure.
when we talk about because and I guess for people that maybe haven't seen other things that I've done, I'm a very, very loud and outspoken advocate for paying for open source,
Hmm.
um, because I like people.
Yeah,
And I think if we're not careful, the people that do great works get trampled by the system around it. And
yeah,
very anathema to a lot of people that think open source is just software that's free at the point of consumption and
yeah,
fuck you all,
yeah,
right? And unfortunately, that doesn't work for me as an adult anymore.
sure.
And I think I've gone on this interesting journey with kind of what I love in open source, which is it came from this kind of computer club mentality and
Hmm.
community of people sharing cool things they've done. And my point is always this: there's this kind of sentiment that open source won the fight. Open source is everywhere. We won. We wanted
Yeah,
everyone to use our stuff. And sitting here, 40 odd years old, all I can think is, well, what did we really win?
yeah,
What we won was responsibility and accountability,
yeah,
while other people who were always ghouls all along tuck the money out of the system. Actually, like we
yeah,
didn't really win. They let us win a game
yeah,
that was a different game than the markets were playing and that the organizations were paying. And that most organizations, when they leverage open source, aren't doing it for the good of anyone or because they're trying to help you. They're doing it because they sure as hell like free value,
yeah, yeah,
right? And I love software. I love teaching. I love people. I like the people that make things. And I really think that the culture of open source hasn't learned to understand power imbalance,
yeah,
because the relationship that I have with you or someone I spoke to on Usenet when I was 14 years old is not the same power dynamic
yeah.
between me and the 10 largest companies in the world.
Sure, sure.
It just isn't like it's not an equitable exchange of value, right?
Yeah,
And I really want open source to remember what it was really great at, which was building things for people that love to operate them and use them and doing all the cool stuff and making better tech. Not, I don't want it to be remembered for being co-opted as this thing that literally allowed itself to get exploited
sure.
by hyper capitalists
Yeah,
because they made us feel good,
yeah,
right? They made us feel good. They basically validated our place in all of this. And I think that's kind of a sadness. And I think a cultural shift has to happen before people really understand this. And I think we're slowly starting to get there
Yeah.
because we just see this topic again and again and again.
Well, I mean, for folks that are watching this in the future, like this is the end of April in 2025, and like you and I are both part of like the .NET community, right?
Yeah.
And like the .NET community for the last few years has gone through this shift, in my opinion, where if folks know .NET, like it used to be a closed source technology that was built and maintained by Microsoft, and then they open sourced it. And with that, there was all this community engagement and people building amazing things and making it available for free. And now we're seeing a lot of large open source projects decide, hey, I think it's time that I should make a little bit of something on top of the work that I've been doing. I've been giving this thing for 10 years for free, 15 years for free. If you are a huge company that's using it, you got to pay me now. And
Yep.
I've talked to some maintainers on the show, and I've always said that like anybody who questions your value, or anybody that questions your decision to make money off something that you did in your spare time when you could have been paying attention to your wife and kids or your husband and kids or whoever, partner and kids, is, like you said, a ghoul.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, 100%. And I think it's so, I'm so proud, honestly, of the maintainers in the .NET ecosystem. Some of these people are my friends, people I know personally, but they are finally realizing that we got it wrong.
Yeah.
A little bit in the best way. And it's interesting because I've been doing a talk over the past couple of years, and the middle bit in it is a bit of a mea culpa about how I fucked up, right? And how in my 20s and early 30s, I was a big advocate for organizations adopting liberally licensed free software.
Yeah.
Right? When actually I made a mistake because I didn't know. I was too young. I was too naive, probably. And what I should have probably been advocating for was that we were to buy support contracts and to donate time. And to I was advocating for the wrong thing. Instead, I myself sat there and wrote policy documents saying, oh, well, we're only ever going to use MIT license packages because that means that we don't have to pay these people and it's fine. And I was the villain in the story.
Yeah.
And I think it takes enough self-reflection to look back and be like, oh God, like every time I did that, I may as well have been punching my friends.
Yeah.
Or me in the future. Like it was the wrong call.
It's hard. And I think this is like the underlying problem with open source is that when you go to a GitHub repo or you download a NuGet package or an NPM package, the person's face isn't there, right there in your face, right? There's no humanity in it, right? There's only humanity when I have a problem and I need my problem fixed. And it's challenging for me because, one, I'm lazy. I'm going to use everything, right? Like
path of least resistance, right? It's not you doing a bad thing.
Yeah.
You're just doing what everyone's doing.
Yeah. And, that's why I advocate and I like little sponsorship here. If you can throw somebody some GitHub sponsors or buy me a coffee or all the other things, like it's valuable. Yeah. Because I have an open source project that people use, and every now and then, like I get monthly, like a couple of bucks here or there, but every now and then somebody will give like a non-trivial amount, like $20, $30. And I'm like, and immediately I'm like, wow, okay. It fuels me to like want to continue to do it, because I think that there's this bell curve, right? With building anything. And after you get to the crust, the peak, it's not as enjoyable for you. You get ADHD, there's something else, maybe you change technology stacks. And, if you're engaging with a project that's on the right side of the bell curve, like you're dealing with a maintainer who probably is to an extent checked out. I can't imagine and I'm just going to name drop, but like, I don't know how folks like Jimmy Bogart or like any of those
Jimmy
folks
texts me every day, tells me how much he loves maintaining AutoMap.
No, but like I know enough of these people, and I've had drinks with them, and I've had dinner with them, and it's like, and I'm like, how are you able to sit there and every time you open up GitHub, there's like 30 issues on your repo, and everybody there's a dick. Like, how do you like not just punch every wall that comes within 10 feet? So it's wild to me.
So for my money in this space, and it's interesting, like the Jimmy Bogard programmatic universe of packages obviously are currently in their their open source glow up licensing
Yeah.
era, and I'm very, very excited to see it because Jimmy's put in a lot of work over years.
Yeah.
Should never say nice things about Jimmy in public; it goes to his head. But I think for my money, where we need to go next is really important. I've been starting to write down a bit of a spec at the moment, where I think a lot of the things that you were saying about kind of charity really resonate with me, but I always feel very, very conflicted about it. Like, I think it's really nice that people do donations. And I think, you'll see like every quarter or whatever, like Microsoft or Amazon
Yeah.
will go and throw $2,000 at someone, and someone will be like, oh God, this is so good. Now, I used to work in the third sector in the UK, the charity sector. And there's one sentence that has always stuck in my mind since then, which is, charity does not replace the need for
Yeah.
a good welfare state.
Sure.
Right, we
Yeah.
need a real solution to this thing, and I think we can accidentally mistake charity for an answer. Now, I think that, and I kind of, I love friends at Microsoft, but I need to shine a light at them very, very specifically because they own a lot of the means of distribution of open source software today. They own GitHub, they own npm, they own NuGet. There's a wealth of stuff that they look after. And I think they've long shied away from this concept of monetizing open source because there's lots of difficult questions. Who gets the money? How do contributor licenses work? How do we do distribution? All of these questions. And I think basically they've backed away from the problem a number of times because it feels like there's no answer.
No.
What I actually think that they need to start thinking about, and I've started to put some of this stuff into writing, I'm going to publish a thing quite soon, is supplying the primitives to let people that are creating things make their own choices. So we enable people, we don't try and give them an answer, right? So we put on package metering where you can measure average monthly users. You can measure all of these core statistics that you could start to put business and billing models around. So instead of coming out and saying we're going to solve the open source maintainability problem by putting in invoicing, I want them to put in the levers. They have they have the infrastructure to use Azure billing, and with AWS to use AWS billing. They need to start allowing organizations to add organization IDs to package feeds and package restore operations, so we can start to meter the use of some of this stuff. Because when we start recording the data, people that own the packages can then start to license around it, right? They can do realistic dual licensing that becomes payment of people's cloud bills. Right, and we can have blending models with caps and ceilings and notches. And I think a lot of the people, when we think about these things, like, oh, but what if people abuse the system? It's like, man, if people are going to steal from you, they'll fucking steal from you anyway.
I mean, there's something to say about, like, you're saying the system isn't being abused currently. Like,
well,
I mean,
yeah, exactly. Just a different kind of abuse. So I really passionately think like the next era for especially kind of less vended software but more software component open source is to support multi-license model billing and metering in a way that gives creators, like, so people like Jimmy could say, cool, well, if you're making, if you're using this less or your company is less than this size, whatever, it's free. I don't care. You're not my support problem. But, if you're making a couple of £1 million a year, great. You're getting metered payments. And it's going to be based on a rolling number of seats. And that's it. And, I think that's what the community really needs. Rather than forcing people into business models that different people don't have to agree with or decide on, we need options. We need options for sustainability.
I think the problem, and I think there's some brilliant thoughts in that approach. My biggest concern is that this isn't just a .NET problem, right? Every technology has this open source package management problem. And just because I think .NET and to an extent Java are like they're more likely for more big companies are going to use that software than companies that probably don't meet whatever threshold, right? It makes a ton of sense. But still, like, and I know how this will go. If .NET decides to do something like this, and then Microsoft and Azure and whatever all partner together, people will start switching technology stacks. People will, like, companies will do whatever they can.
Will they switch in or will they switch away?
Away. Like, I've like, just look at all the discourse that you see. It's like, okay, so
Yeah,
Chris makes a, Chris Harrison, who runs mass transit, right? He basically says like this is going to be a new licensing model, and then what's the first thing that pops up? What are the alternatives to mass transit, right? And look, I understand if you're a hobbyist open source developer, and for whatever reason now you can't use a package because of some reason, that's more than likely not the case, because usually they're targeting people, the companies, right? But if all of a sudden you have a project and you can't use a package that you're dependent on, that's a bummer. That sucks. I get it. I've been there. But like turning that into like, hey, this guy stinks. Who else can we grift? Who else can we manipulate to take their free stuff?
Super gross.
Yeah.
Super gross. And I think it's a cultural touch point, that isn't
Yeah.
it, really? And like, every time someone says that, I just think you're talking about yourself. You're literally hitting yourself.
Yeah.
Every time you hit one of these people. I think the truth is probably this, right? I don't think any of these pricing models are ever trying to target the hobbyists, the peers. Again, the spirit of the community is still as strong as it's ever really been. I think this, though, I think that creators would switch to programming languages, platforms, and distribution methods that prioritize their own sustainability. And if people wanted the work, they would have to follow.
Yeah.
I don't really, I care more about NPM than I do about NewDay or Maven to start off with, right?
Yeah.
Because we need to normalize it in the biggest communities.
Sure.
And there are different, there's different criticality of packages, right? And paying is not the only way that open source can be sustained, right? Libraries like, say, React have been long stewarded by large organizations who use them as effectively sales tools.
Yep.
That's okay. That's a perfectly equitable exchange of value. Like, it's not like companies can't ethically engage with the open source community. I just think that normal users need to get it into their heads that if you're being paid to do your job so you can eat,
Yeah.
that other person also needs to be paid so they can also eat.
Yeah, I totally agree. And that leads me to like the last part of this conversation though I have is this AI thing. Because we all know what's training the AI, right?
Yeah, genie's out of the bottle on this one.
Right.
So, like it's
right. So
its way through.
Yeah, so it's one of these things where it's like, okay, not only are individuals or organizations taking advantage of open source for the free work, but now you have AI models that are being trained on that work to basically do another angle of the same thing, get code into people's hands faster. So what
have we just produced a perfect plagiarism machine?
I mean, it's funny because sometimes it does create unique code. Other times it copy and pastes code with comments in it. It's very interesting how these LLMs work, right? No one really understands how they work, but sometimes they literally just regurgitate out like from a repo. Sometimes it actually creates code that's new. So I'm curious as to your thoughts is like in this world where, I'm an open source maintainer and I've decided like, okay, like I want value to be brought back to me. I've been giving out value for so long. So I need to combat nefarious characters with licensing. I need to figure out a way to make sure my code isn't scrapable via some model. And then it becomes this thing where you're running a business. When I was just writing code, I just was writing code in my spare time, and now I have like this business that I have all these supply chain vulnerabilities that I need to worry about.
Yeah, I think, God, there's so much in here to unpack, right? I think I'll come back to that original point that if someone's going to steal from you, they're going to steal from you anyway.
Yeah.
And there is nothing you can ever do to stop that, right? So once you take away like, oh, but what if someone downloads the package and puts it up in an internal feed? It's like, sure, they're going to steal from you.
Yeah.
That's cool. They were never going to pay you. Don't worry about them.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Not a problem. Once we move past that and we look at the AI thing, AI is simultaneously one of the most interesting things that's happened in my career, and also the most overhyped and non-realized kind of potential as it is. Like the two things are true at the same time.
Yeah.
I think, what is the ethical consideration of training models on open source works? Well, I suppose we're really just accelerating what was already happening at speed. Do I think that's ethically sound? Don't know.
Yeah.
No, I think the answer is it probably isn't, right? And I think we've contended with this with each of the major forms of thing that's been metabolized by AI. Like, is it really okay for AI to be trained on the entire internet? Those are effectively unattributed copyrighted works.
Yep.
But people kind of presume that because it's the whole internet, then, well, is it really that different from what search engines do?
Yeah.
Well, maybe not. So we kind of you slip down the slippery slope a little bit.
Sure.
And then we train on image data that is mostly illegally scraped.
Yeah.
And you look at it and you're like, well, they're not really reproducing the same images.
Yeah.
But you can kind of see where some of it comes from. And, is it really different from a search engine? Well, I don't know. Maybe, maybe not. And then really, this is just the same thing being applied to code. But the thing about code is that code is by definition more constrained and more structured.
Yeah.
So it's much easier to get like direct output from source data. Like
Sure.
There's a much greater chance, given that it's under constraints,
Yeah.
that something syntactically correct will come out is the same as another sample. So I think it's murky. And what I imagine is going to happen is everyone's going to throw their hands up and just say, well, we don't really know. It's a bit like music, isn't it?
Yeah.
Where music inspires other music.
Yeah.
How does that make me feel? I think people will get harmed by it. I think
Sure.
artists have been harmed by it. I think programmers will probably be harmed by it. I think writers have been harmed by it. The models on the other side will probably enable entire new categories of interaction and creativity that wouldn't have been possible before. I don't know whether I think that justifies starving the people that did the original work, but I think it's going to happen anyway.
Yeah. There are some parallels to music, obviously not as dire as like, oh, you're using my chord progression, so I'm going to sue you. Right. You can't sue somebody for using a for loop, but I think there is a lot of concern in my world about it's just I'm not even, honestly, and this is going to sound terrible, I'm not worried about as much about the people that are getting the code taken from them. I'm worried more about the people that are using that code and don't really know what it is. And
it's a scary thing.
Yeah, because I've prided myself on kind of being a curious person, right? But with being curious, I'm also pretty lazy, and I'm very guilty of copy paste from Stack Overflow, copy paste from some random MSDN form, using Copilot or Claude or whatever to give me some a function, right? Or ChatGPT or whatever. But I do that extra step where I actually look at it afterwards.
So it's
and my fear is my fear is the people that sometimes you don't have time to look. If it builds and it gives you the output that you want, cool.
So I can tell you what my policy for my teams at work is on this case.
Okay, that'd be great.
I'm a cautiously optimistic AI moderate would probably be how I would describe myself at a push. We use Copilot. We give it to all of our programmers. The rules are very, very simple. You wrote it, you own it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Nothing is different from any work that you would have gone and looked at the internet for or written yourself. Like, we still require the same amount of rigor.
Yeah.
Now, I think the interesting problem or the interesting scenario with AI code gem is I think people often think about it as something that's more powerful for creating new works. I actually think these tools are much more useful with reducing the amount of software that we own. And I'm much more interested in the thread of using AI models to refactor, reduce, make safer things we have, rather than just kind of pour more code onto the bonfire, right? I don't think you get good, like everything I've ever done in software tells me that just adding more software is probably a terrible idea. Right? More is not better.
No, definitely not.
I think there's some like really interesting use cases where you can use it for less, and that is interesting.
Yeah, I think also like the one thing that makes me very uncomfortable is like the idea of, and this isn't even about like the whole replacing developers thing, but it's like replacing developer activities. And I even kind of said this when like GitHub's Dependabot first came out, right? Where it would scan your code and it would say, okay, you have some out-of-date NuGet packages. Here's a pull request to update them. I immediately was like, my response was, who's going to do that testing? That was kind of that was my first kind of retort to it. And now we're seeing more and more with all these kind of this agentic stuff where it's like, okay, well, Now, all you got to do is like in a prompt, like here's the issue, open a PR that fixes this issue. And then the responsibility is like, I've been this person, so I'm going to just say it. Like, thoughts and prayers to the guy who has to review those PRs with no context, and they got to make sure it works. And if it doesn't work, you're having to then play, chat tag with an AI assistant.
With an AI,
yeah.
Right. Yeah.
So.
Yeah, I truly think all of the most interesting work that I've seen with AI at the moment falls into one or two camps. Either it's the original definition of vibe coding, where you don't even consider the software.
Sure.
Like pure output only. I think that has some merit to a point before it breaks, but it's mostly a toy. And then I think the other thing that is really useful is using it as like a super capable, structured find, replace, code inspector, reducer. And I've spent a lot of time over the last couple of months doing that thing, and I feel like that's a much more authentic use of the technology, because it isn't just reproducing other people's work.
Sure.
It's using it to remix your work, which is very similar again to like the creative process of artists for time immemorial, right? And I think that's like just a better hammer is good enough, I think.
Yeah. No, I agree. My biggest fear is just it's not people being nefarious. It's always just people running out of time. Because, I talked a little bit about the pain, right? Like, and this is a terrible analogy, I apologize. Like, sometimes morphine isn't the best option. Right? Like, and if it's this thing, it's like, give me something that fixes the pain now. Okay, this is great, but now I need that every day of my life.
I think there's potentially a charitable read on this through the lens of open source. Now, one of my absolute favorite things about open source as a culture was that really we were sharing and learning from each other. That was a lot of what we got in the early days of open source, and in the middle era, right? You were learning from code that was made available. You could charitably argue that whilst we always thought we were going to be training people, if we train machines to build models that are usable by more people than would have originally benefited from that knowledge by reading the original works, maybe there's a net good here.
Yeah.
Maybe the spirit is actually somehow intact in the thing. I don't know if I believe that, but I think there's a charitable read that sounds a little bit like that.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, you're an optimist, I think. I think maybe more of a pessimist. So like, I immediately think of like all the terrible things that can happen. But I continue to put my faith in this industry, this community, because I don't know anything else. So it's one of the
because we're stuck here together.
Yeah, exactly. And I think at the end of the day, like, not to quote Jeff Goldblum, but like life finds a way, right? Like we'll figure it out, and it's just a matter of, again, like being able to navigate like what is pain versus like what is pain that's going to turn into good versus pain that is just going to turn into more pain.
I guess I perceive myself to be an optimistic nihilist, is my kind of world outlook, in that nothing really matters, so all we have is this, so we may as well do this really well.
Yeah, my therapist has told me multiple times, stop saying pessimist and saying you're a realist, and I'm like, that's not a good thing. That's not a good thing. Like if you see
telling me all the bad things are coming
true.
if
you see the world, if you see reality is only negative, that's not a good thing. This has been a great conversation, dude. Like I've really appreciated getting to know a little bit about your backstory, talking about some of the things that you find passionate about, and in general, like I was talking to you before, like we've never actually had like a long conversation, and I'm looking forward to the next time we get an opportunity to do this, because I think we could just shoot the shit on this stuff like for hours.
Yeah, just hang out, man.
Yeah, and so for folks that you're not already following David, I highly recommend you do. Probably best way these days is on Blue Sky. So you can find him at davidwhitney.co.uk. So davidwhitney.co.uk. There'll also be some links to other places that you can find him. It's a great follow. I really recommend it. Before we sign off, my friend, do you have any parting words?
I think as long as everybody that uses software remembers that there's people doing it,
the
world will get better.
Yeah. Yeah, I totally agree, because I think these days specifically, we're running out of humanity. And if we can find humanity where it exists already, it's a good thing. So
I had this one rambling anecdote that I won't share, but I'll share the sentence at the end of it, which is, someone once I saw was asked what is the, why do they do what they do? Why did they choose to do their career path? It was like a university commencement thing, and they said one sentence which floored me. They said, the meaning of life is very, very simple. It's to spend your time doing things that inflict the least violence on the humanity left inside of you.
ugh.
And it was the perfect mic drop sentence.
Yeah.
And I've shared that with so many people since. It's just like, oh God, you're right.
Yeah, that's really good.
That is what you're meant to be doing.
Oh man, that's solid, because it tickles every little thing that we've talked about for like the last hour. Again, this is great. Thank you so much, David, for hanging out. Thanks for the folks that are tuning in and the folks listening in the future. This has been Isaac Levin for Coffee and Open Source, from my friend David Whitney. Hope you enjoy the